Well, it came and it went like a magic poof in the air. Snow White, the most anticipated flopbuster of 2025, which was supposed to come out last year, but was pushed back because Rachel Zeglar can't keep her big fat brown mouth shut for the life of her, instead opting to run it and attack her co-stars, the original story of Snow White, and so on and so forth. We've heard this story a million times, as this might be the most oversaturated story on the YouTube marketplace. But that doesn't keep me from wanting to talk about it, especially because I've seen the movie. And I just rewatched the original one, this copy that I have. And let me tell you, it doesn't pale in comparison. The original Snow White has so much charm, so much heart, so much specialness to it. Whereas this live action is soulless and utterly bland, taking so many liberties with the story that if they called it a different story, they might have made some money. If they said that this was inspired by Snow White and called it something else, maybe Snow Brown and the Seven Animated Abominations might have made some money back. But instead, by insisting on coattailing off of the success of the 1937 classic, they instead guaranteed them and set themselves up for comparison that they could not live up to. And if you're not really here to listen to me review the movie, skip to approximately 7 minutes into the video, and that's when I'll be getting into the article about how Rachel Zeglar can't keep her big fat mouth shut and doesn't understand that the movie was a flop. You see, there were only 2 points of praise I had for the entirety of the live action movie, and they were the dwarf scene when they're mining, and then it's when Snow White first comes to the house with all the animated creatures, because it's nothing but animated creatures being cute. It's the kind of thing that I could have gotten from literally anything except for Mufasa, where Rachel Zeglar doesn't talk one bit, she doesn't run her mouth, and therefore she doesn't tarnish the scene. And then the dwarf scene, while the dwarves are an abomination for the most part, though I don't mind the appearance of Doc, Grumpy, and Sleepy, the other 4 dwarves are completely devoid of personality and are utterly nondescript. You could not tell the other 4 dwarves apart from one another, and this scene that's playing in the background of the dwarves doing their dwarf stuff was kind of well done, and I enjoyed the dwarf song that they sang. That's it. That's the praise. I guess I could praise the opening part, despite the fact that it's all short and exposition and was clearly done in a reshoot. I do have to praise them for the fact that Snow White's main role model does so happen to be her father, who was a fair and positive king instead of a toxic male figure, but of course that means they had to get rid of him as soon as possible. It could have been a lot worse, I will say, but it also should have been better. Not so much could have, but should have. The film was not enjoyable, whereas the classic film is utterly endearing, utterly mesmerizing. It is the kind of thing that will hold up for another 100 years. It is the kind of movie that will not tarnish. Rachel Zeglar called this film dated, but I have to say, in comparison, Snow White 2025 was dated at 2024 when it's supposed to release and will not be remembered ever. Even when coming with discussion of the biggest flops, people will forget to mention this one because of how little they care. Whereas when they talk about the legacy, Walt Disney's first animated classic will be remembered for a long, long time. I just watched it, like I mentioned, on my old VCR, and I have to say, the music design, the art design, everything was so romantically built, so designed in such a way that it shows how much somebody loves life, and loves the real world, and loves the world of animation. It's the kind of movie that one can justify showing to family without being embarrassed that they might laugh at the overt Marxist messaging. With the original one not being too terrifying, and most importantly not being dated, because the only thing in there that could be seen as dated is something that should not be, such as overt Christian themes, as Snow White prays in one scene, and heteronormity as she desires true love's kiss. The songs in the original are far better integrated into the story, and one of the issues with the live action is it's clear that the way that they view music now is as a set piece, whereas in the original, music was simply a way to enhance the experience. The live action Snow White was a musical, and not a very good one at that, with the movie simply trying to move you from one song to the next song, with these songs being completely vapid and devoid of any kind of heart or soul, whereas the older ones were much more enjoyable and lively. Let's also not forget that Rachel Zeglar's Snow White is an unlikable cow, completely incapable of taking accountability or taking charge in any way, whereas the animated Snow White actually does go ahead and show these values that the live action one praises and desires. What is it? Truthful, kind, brave, and something else. All of these values, Snow White wears a pendant that literally walks you through it, and when Snow White does something akin to these values, the movie literally stops to tell you that Snow White has these positive values. Whereas in the older version, we know Snow White is kind and brave and everything else because she shows it to us through various very small scenes. Very tiny segments of the movie highlight these incredibly positive traits within Snow, whereas in the live action it is utterly overt because no one would believe that Snow White has those behaviors. And let's not even forget the cleaning scene. When Snow White first gets to the dwarven hut, she doesn't force the dwarves to clean, instead she helps the animals clean. And in the live action, Snow White refuses to pick up a broom, she doesn't do anything. Snow White literally does nothing to help clean in the live action, whereas in the animated one, as she puts it, and I'll use the broom. She actively helps and leads the animals and corrects them when they do it wrong. She's homey, she's matriarchal, and she's kind. She actively puts others before herself in the actual animated movie, whereas the live action one does none of that whatsoever. And of course, what might be one of the bigger failings as well is the fact that they wanted to use this new postmodernist ideology of fair. Instead of relying on fairness being beauty, they want to use fairness as justice and inner beauty and whatnot. Problem is, they break that rule very consistently, as from the very get-go, the mirror refers to the queen as being the fairest for being the most beautiful, but later in the movie they completely ditch this motif to describe Snow White as being fair internally, which, if you want to be consistent, not that this movie has any aims of being consistent whatsoever, that is a massive violation. They claim to make this change, but they don't stick with it for more than 5 seconds. The only other praise I'll give the live action for attempting is to build further on the relationship between her and the prince. Problem is, all of that relationship building done in the live action is done through exposition and really cringy scenes, ones that add to the already bloated feeling runtime. You see, it's crazy, the live action is an hour 40, whereas the animated is an hour 20, and the animated one doesn't feel like it drags. But the live action one feels like it both drags and rushes sometimes at the same time. Ultimately, it is a terrible movie. And honestly, I guarantee you, if Walt Disney wanted to make a couple of bucks, all they would have to do is to re-release the original one in the theaters, and they would get a whole lot more traction than anyone trying to go and watch this abomination and bastardization. The only way this movie could have succeeded is if they either stayed very close to the animated one, using the tricks of animation to show that level of intricacy in real life, or if they simply changed the name to not be Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, because this movie is about as close to Snow White as I am. But of course, I've got more than a review for you today, because as we all know, Rachel Zeglar is a self-appointed narcissist, someone who can't help herself but tout her own horn at every given moment. And she seems to be under the impression that this movie is a box office win. What a delusional cow. So, before we go any further, like, subscribe, and let's get into what she had to say. As Rachel Zeglar proudly touts Snow White box office and tone-deaf victory lap on Instagram, as film crashes and burns immediately disables comments written by Imentanero over at That Park Place. Even with the already tumultuous release of Snow White and the marketing around it, Rachel Zeglar has at every single turn tried to make it worse by opening her mouth and saying something to piss everybody off. If you want to go with her comments on the original film that I mentioned before, or her attacks against people who voted for the Orange Man, Rachel Zeglar just can't help herself, and this time she's decided to do it again, going so far as to celebrate her release. Now, I can't fault her for trying to give some positive spin, talk about how much of a win it is, because when you say something, some people will think it's true, and when enough people think it's true, you might just get away with it. So I understand why she's out here celebrating it, because technically, Snow White is the #1 movie in the box office right now. But then again, that's like being the highest jumper when it comes to crossing the border wall. As Snow White has utterly faceplanted into theaters with a dismal $42.2 million domestic opening and $85.3 million worldwide, Zeglar posted a photo of her popping out of what appears to be her trailer, striking a pose, and proudly proclaiming herself Queen of the Week. In the comments, disabled of course, because even she knows that the reaction would have been. And like I said, the comments on her Instagram posts are disabled, so nobody can say anything positive, because no one would say anything mean on the internet, right, Zeglar? But it would seem like even Rachel Zeglar doesn't get to know any peace. Even with her trying to disable comments, people still come to call her out on her bullshit. And that box office failure is absolutely hysterical to look at. An $85.3 million total opening weekend compared to a $200 to $300 million budget and an ungodly high marketing budget, because ads for this were everywhere. This movie has about as high of a chance of making its budget back as a communist revolution actually succeeding. And why is it, despite the fact that this movie had an abysmal opening, was it the queen of the box office? Well, simply because it was at the worst time of the year. Nobody releases anything early March because it's miserable out there and there's really no reason to go and most people are in school. So nobody really slots any movies for this time of the year. And therefore, it had no competition. Taking a look at my Regal app, which is how I went and saw the movie, because I pay for Regal Unlimited, $21 a month, unlimited films, and that way I never have to give my actual full-on ticket price to Disney or any other company. The only competition right now is Mickey 17, which failed, Novocaine, which is getting poor reception, Auto Nights, which nobody knew about, and Captain African American, and The Day the Earth Blew Up. Those are really the only big movies right now, and only one of those is a family... Oh, hold up. Princess Mononoke is back in theaters. Oh, just for today? Damn, I missed it. Anyway, the only one of those is a family-friendly movie, with the rest of them being a complete and utterly different demographic. None of those movies, by the way, are girl-centered films. The Day the World Blew Up seems to be a male-centric movie, and Captain African American is supposed to be a male-centric movie. Of course, they don't know what that means. But this is going to turn off most of the males in the audience. So it wasn't really competing against any movies. And despite the fact that it was competing against nothing, it still fell well below projections. But it's kind of funny that Rachel Zeglar is celebrating this as a box office win, when in fact Rachel Zeglar has never experienced a box office win, as the four main movies, from Y2K to that Hunger Game movie to West Side Story and now this. Despite the fact that several of them have been considered box office number ones, none of them have ever made their budget back. So while Rachel Zeglar and the Disney adults can keep cheering on the failure that is this movie, pretending it's a success, we all know that it isn't. And the people who saw the movie, because none of these shills have, all know that this movie is an absolute disaster. An absolute embarrassment, especially when it comes to being Disney putting this out. If this was put out by any other company, no one would really care. But the fact that Walt Disney's brand was literally founded because of this movie, and they're going out here and they're shitting on Walt Disney's legacy while still using his name. You could hook Walt Disney up to a motor and he'd power it just by the speed that he's spinning in his grave. But hey, we've got the soulless looking Lilo and Stitch live action adaptation coming out soon, so maybe that won't be as terrible. But let's be honest, Disney doesn't have the magic, doesn't have the soul, and doesn't have the heart to make a good movie, and at this point we can all really hope that Disney never knows peace. But that's pretty much all I've got. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about this, and I will see you guys on the next one. And as an aside, I will be on a live stream later tonight over at the channel Iron Oxide doing the weekly Rogues Gallery. Come join and check me out if you want. We'll be going live at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.